Please welcome the Unlikely Alliances in the Food System panel moderator, Monica Ang, reporter, WBEZ.
We've got 30 minutes to talk to 6 really smart people and me, so let's start introducing ourselves. Your name, what you do, and maybe a 30-second anecdote about an unlikely alliance that you have seen in the food system. So let's start on the end, sir.
Hi.
Young man on the end.
My name is Ken Quinn. I'm president of the World Food Prize Foundation in Des Moines, started by Dr. Norman Borlaug, and Nobel Peace Prize laureate. I put on an event every year, every October, where we bring people to our Borlaug Dialogue, like David MacLennan, and also smallholder farmers from Ghana and Nigeria, and everyone in between. Also do an Iowa Hunger Summit. The director, Crystal Harris, is here. And we bring the food pantries together. Oxfam America is there, as well as CropLife International. So everyone's at the table. And those are pretty unusual alliances, I think.
Thank you. Thanks.
So I'm Pat O'Neill. I'm the CEO of a company called Amp Your Good. Raise your hand if you've ever made a food donation to a food drive. All right, great. That's just about everybody. So what our company has done is we've developed a different food drive model that enables people to donate fresh produce, fresh fruits and vegetables, and other healthy food to food drives. And I would say that our unlikely alliance is that we are a for-profit company doing work in what is traditionally thought of and is mostly a non-for-profit system.
Hi everyone, I'm Alesha Black, and you already heard I'm with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We put together publications every year that essentially continue to make the argument that the US government and private sector and NGOs have a big role to play in combating world hunger. And in the process of putting those reports together, we do dozens, if not sometimes over 100 consultations each year to inform our work. And just, I guess, to give you 2 unlikely constituencies that we find are powerful voices when we go and speak to the US government, US farmers are often big advocates for supporting smallholder farmers in emerging economies. They understand that when these markets develop and grow, it will mean more new markets for them, but they also understand how difficult it is to farm. So they're a powerful and unlikely alliance, perhaps. And the second I would offer is actually the military. Military understands that peace and security around the world requires food security, and that this is sort of a fundamental building block to a peaceful world. And so we find that military officials and the defense community is often a big advocate as well.
Hi everyone, Sarah Vared. I'm the Interim Director of ReFed, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative of over 30 nonprofit, for-profit, and government entities that was developed to create a roadmap to guide us on how to reduce US food waste by 20%. I think the unlikely alliance that I can speak to is really the work that we've done of bringing together such a variety of different entities to try to tackle the food waste issue. Although I would throw out that even though it's unlikely bringing these different stakeholders together, the issue of food waste is something that spans across the food system and can ultimately be a win-win-win for the environment, for the economy, and for social issues. And so I think in that way, there's actually a likely alliance that has been forming around this issue.
I'm Jonathan Pereira, the Executive Director of Plant Chicago. We're a nonprofit on the southwest side of Chicago. Our mission is to develop circular economies. Very brief, we are located in a building known as The Plant. It is a 93,000 square foot former meat packing facility that's being repurposed into a net zero collaborative community of food businesses. The unlikely alliances we have is really co-located small food businesses, over a dozen right now, that are located in the facility, from bread to beer, mushrooms, kombucha, various greens operations, ice, spice, and more. And then a for-profit owner developer of the building. So our unlikely alliance is that we literally have 12 small food businesses within the building and a for-profit entity that we're collaborating with and partnering with.
David, you mentioned a big one here with the soy and deforestation. Did you have another you wanted to talk about?
One that's most recent is, and one of the speakers from the panel this morning was with Heifer International. So we're partnering with Heifer International in China to improve production for 450 female poultry farmers. We give them chicks to get their farm started, but also teach them about animal nutrition, chicken nutrition, feed to help their production. I don't know if that's unlikely, but it's a partnership we've never had before, and it's very likely now. So. working well.
As David mentioned, we're in a pretty divisive time. My significant other is from Cleveland. I am a lifelong Chicago Cubs fan. And so I know about trying to heal after dissension. And we just had a little bit, a little election. And Ken, you said you had a story about both the election and the Cubs
And
win.
the Cubs, I mean.
Yeah.
So, Norman Borlaug, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, plant pathologist, works in Mexico, India, Pakistan. But his real dream in life, what he wanted more than anything, was to play second base for the Chicago Cubs. And the link, though, to our politics, I live in Iowa. We've seen nothing but these terrible, divisive political commercials for a year and a half. But always, from the beginning of the campaign till the end, the one person, the one organization, the one event that can always get the most conservative Republicans and the most liberal, progressive Democrats in the same room at the same time is Norman Borlaug and the World Food Prize. Because Borlaug was motivated by alleviating human suffering. And if you're looking for one thing to build some bridge in our country after this election, that's one that will resonate. If you watch CNN this morning, Iowa Congressman Steve King, very well-known conservative, was on being interviewed. He would come to our events at the State Department with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I'm the only one with a photo of the two of them together. Such is the power of Norman Borlaug. And Paul Ryan's wife is a cousin of Norman Borlaug. So there's a moment here, an opportunity here, to build on that, this unusual alliance, to use that common thread of caring about suffering people, particularly at Thanksgiving time, to find some way to knit together the concerns about our food system in America and the 900 million hungry people who Norman Borlaug cared about desperately all around the world, most of them women smallholder farmers.
Speaking of this growing planet of hungry people, that's a kind of divisive issue. Some people say, well, we need GMOs to feed them. Other people say, well, actually, other types of farming will keep the soil healthy. But I think one thing people are agreeing on is a reduction in food waste. 40% by some estimates of all the edible food in this country is tossed in the garbage. Sarah, you've been working with a plan, the roadmap, that looks at 27 cost-effective, feasible ways to reduce this by 20%. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so through ReFed, we recognized that there had been a lot of attention and a lot of focus on the problem of food waste, how much we're wasting, the environmental impacts of it, the social impacts of it, and a lot less of a focus on the solutions, the tangible, real solutions that are there and very feasible that we as a country and also as a global society can be taking to really address this issue. So through the roadmap, we created a data-driven guide for business, for government, foundations, investors, nonprofits, all stakeholders across the supply chain for solutions that they can take today that are feasible, technologically feasible. There's business cases for all of them that can prevent food waste from happening in the first place, ensure that the wasted food that we do create can actually be recovered for people who are in need, and then ultimately recycle the food scraps that we have at the end. So across these 27 solutions that we looked at, we found that they're going to require $18 billion of investment over the next decade. But that's going to result in over $100 billion of economic value. So this is an issue, and I mentioned it at the beginning, that truly is something that really cuts across all of these different social, environmental, and economic kind of constraints that we think about and that we face. And $18 billion is a big number. It's not something to kind of sneeze at, but what we found is that it's 1/10 of a penny per pound of food that's reduced, or that's not wasted anymore. And then this kind of 5x return on that investment really shows just how business sound it is to actually really be addressing this food waste. So we're really excited and enthused by the action that we're already seeing happen on the ground today, and then how we see more and more stakeholders continuing to come to this issue and look at what they can be doing throughout their supply chains and throughout their different collaborations to actually really work to reduce food waste. Specifically, we focused on in the United States, but we're seeing a global kind of movement on this issue as well.
And where can people find more about that roadmap?
Yeah, so if you go to refed.com, there's a comprehensive guide that's there. There's a lot of really cool tools, so you can actually sort by, do I care about greenhouse gas emissions? Do I care about feeding hungry people? Do I care just purely about the economics of it? And what we found is there's different parts of the solutions, different parts of the puzzle that you're going to care about more, depending on the lens that you come to the issue at. But for everyone, there's something to kind of dive in, grab a hold of, and start taking action on today.
Thanks. Now, Pat, both you and Jonathan talked about some sort of unlikely profit, nonprofit partnerships. Can you both kind of elaborate on that?
Sure. Yeah, so I think the unlikely component, when you look at, just backing up a little bit, our mission is to develop circular economies. So a circular economy, if that's a new term for anyone, the best way to really define that is to contrast it with what it's not. A linear system is thinking in one direction. That's how individuals, many businesses, we think in one direction. We put a lot of effort into thinking about what goes in to our bodies or our product, but not a lot of effort into thinking about what goes out. Because once it's away from us, it's no longer our concern, or at least not in our day-to-day lives. A circular economy, really, the key component of that is decoupling economic growth from infinite resource consumption. How do we keep these materials and nutrients flowing through our systems? The best natural resource is the one that's already been extracted. So when you think about these systems, a circular economy, by its very nature, requires many different entities working together. There's no single individual, no single business that's going to be able to do it. If you're talking about systemic change, it has to be this collective impact. So it has to be this collaboration, particularly between businesses and nonprofits as well. And there is a role that government plays as well. So just our mission itself, it requires us to start forming these alliances.
And not just shy away. Anything for profit is going to be a problem.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, if we're going to have an economic shift, you can only do that with businesses actually engaging in those practices.
Yeah, and I think the inherent tension between a nonprofit organization or mindset and a for-profit mindset is just the wondering, let's say, for the nonprofit side, as to what the motivations of the for-profit company is. And that's something that requires some work to overcome. In our case, we really focused on what we could agree upon were problems that we looked at the same way and tried to devise a solution. I just need to take a minute to explain what this model is that I referred to before. So our food drive model is an online model. You can think of it as a crowdfunding. And organizations that sponsor food drives, and these would be schools, companies, faith-based organizations, and others, use our platform to run their food drive. They get a page that's similar to a crowdfunding page. And when people want to donate to that drive, instead of donating money as they would at a crowdfunding site, they actually pick out and purchase specific food items that are specified by the food pantry or soup kitchen that drive is supporting. So it functions as a bit of a wedding registry. And we're able to let people donate perishable food because our model doesn't involve a collection box, which is really the feature that causes all of you who raised your hands to put non-perishable food as your donation. And so the problem that hunger organizations, and we saw as something that really needed to be tackled, is that the people who are food insecure in this country and in other developed countries suffer from very, very high rates of diet-related health issues, much higher than the rest of the population. And the proximate cause of that is a poor diet. So the poor diet comes from a couple of different places, but in as much as people who are food insecure are going to hunger organizations for food that they eat, the quality of the food at those hunger organizations becomes very important. And so what we were able to agree upon is that our model provides a way for groups who may historically have been raising food that wasn't really optimal and in some cases contraindicated for the people that these hunger organizations are supporting to actually raise the kind of food that those people really need. And I think once you cross the bridge and can agree on a common goal that works for both parties, that's really the sort of the jet fuel that makes a unlikely alliance actually work. And I'll go back to something that David mentioned earlier. I think it's a mindset to look at the things that that represent sharing or shared ideas versus the differences.
It sounds like a really fascinating program. I'd love it if it was spreading to Chicago too. Now, David, I mean, I hadn't been aware of this this moratorium on buying soy from areas that had been deforested. Can you talk about, were people at your company worried, we're giving in to these environmentalists? What were some of those conversations like?
Yeah, at first, yes. And, of course, in a for-profit company, one of the first questions that people ask is, well, it's going to cost us more. And especially then when a significant percentage of the soybeans we were sourcing was coming from farmers from newly deforested land. If you've ever flown over the Amazon, it's heartbreaking because you see this lush green forest and then you see these patches where in the 80s and 90s it had been deforested to grow food, to grow soybeans. Some of it's been replanted, but it'll take years for it to regenerate. So I think with something that at that time, which today it's not radical, I mean, it's part of this, we have the soy moratorium, it's been in place for 10 years. We're going to do this. I mentioned our purpose statement to do it in a safe, responsible, and sustainable way. We're going to be part of the food system, but we're going to focus on sustainability. And if that means it costs us more money, or if it's more difficult or more complicated, we'll figure it out, but it's part of our mission. But initially, to your point, yeah, there was, how are we going to do this? And that means we're going to stop doing business with all these farmers. Yeah, if they're sourcing soybeans on newly deforested land. Same thing with palm oil production in Indonesia. It's a similar program, and there's been a number of unlikely alliances that have come together to try and get that industry to be more sustainable and eliminate the destruction of forest or high carbon stock lands in Indonesia, for example.
So would you say that there's been, and that's a really positive thing if I can think of it, less digging in of both sides and more like, okay, let's think about what's the right thing to do rather than kind of putting our line in the sand?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned when I spoke, when it first came to light, it was contentious. I mean, it was, as I mentioned, it was Greenpeace and Nature Conservancy, and they weren't looking at the actors or the players such as us and some of our customers and our competition in a favorable way. And they looked at it as, look, it's a one long supply chain. It's not just the farmers. Yes, the physical act of deforestation is occurring in these farms, but you, Cargill, others that were in the supply chain are facilitating that. And if you don't help us take action, it's not going to change. And so I think there was emotion. There was emotion in the dialogue at that point in time. There still is. I mean, I don't think we want a world where everybody thinks and acts and does the same thing. You want that tension in the system, but I think it can be a constructive. If you want good results, it's got to be a constructive, not a destructive tension relative to entities that don't necessarily have the same philosophies, but may have the same objectives and goals for how to make the world and the food system better.
Thanks. Alesha, you alluded to a few of the unlikely alliances between domestic farmers and small farmers in other countries, and even alliance with the military and national security folks. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so I think I used the term alliance loosely there, but trying to talk about, I think Ken spoke to the issue of human suffering or food insecurity or poverty. These are really motivational for really pretty much everyone. And the U.S. has been a leader since the late 40s, actually, globally, trying to advocate for solutions that would end hunger and poverty in partnership with other governments, in partnership with the private sector. And in the last 8 to 10 years has really played a big leadership role in this. And so as we go into a new administration, part of what organizations like ours and others will do is to make the case again for why this continues to be a high priority for US foreign policy, in our economic interests, in our national security interests. And so when I mention farmers and also the national security community, you expect organizations that advocate for hungry people or food security to say it's a good idea for our US interests. But when you hear someone who's a top-ranking military official say, actually, food security is a fundamental starting point for peace and security in other regions, and we care about it, it makes a big difference. There's a quote that former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates made, which is, development is cheaper than sending soldiers. And so that voice often carries a different tenor with Congress and with new administrations. And then with US farmers, I believe the figure is last year there was $133 billion of exports from the US around the world to places like Mexico and Brazil, but also places like Nigeria, which are one of the top 10 economies by population and have rising middle class and rising food tastes that mean new markets for farmers. And so US farmers both understand that that as economies develop, it will mean there's more places for their production to go, but they also, I found in my interactions with them, have a deep, compassionate kind of understanding of how difficult it is to be a farmer, especially if you're a small-scale farmer that relies completely on the rain and doesn't have any irrigation and has no insurance. And so I've seen US farmers be some of the most powerful voices as well in speaking to our policymakers about these issues.
Thanks so much. So I've been told we have 34 minutes for Q&A. I've got plenty of other questions, but I'd love to open it up to anyone who has a question. If you want to think about it for a while, you can just stand up and say it, or we have mics.
I'm a professor, so I have a loud voice. I usually don't need one. I loved all the perspectives up here. I am a professor, so I talk about food systems and policy. I'm from Minneapolis, so I'm really excited about the North Market. We do some similar things, nonprofits with our students, so very, very cool. My question is, and I think anybody can answer this, food waste is near and dear to some of the initiatives that I work on. There's so many ways that you can tackle food waste, but some is using some of those end products of production to put into value add new products, not just based on commodity crops, but things like coffee and specialty crops and things like that. So questions on innovative strategies that you all are thinking of or have heard about with using food waste from production of other value-added products. And then also, I have a passion around ugly produce and how you actually, work those channels into innovative partnerships and alliances. So it could be anybody.
Okay, I think Sarah probably has some comments, but everybody.
Well, I can jump on the ugly produce, just something that we're doing. So we've piloted a program with Imperfect Produce, if you're familiar with them. So the idea is that organization could run a food drive where the food that people purchase to donate is sourced from companies that aggregate ugly fruits and vegetables. And what we've been interested in looking at is whether the idea of people conducting a charitable act that actually serves multiple purposes or supports a variety of causes, in this case hunger and the reduction of food waste, if that would change donor behavior. And it, based on limited data at this point, but it appears to very much do that.
Well, maybe just add a few additional thoughts. So through ReFed, we've been tracking innovation broadly across the food waste space, and the area that you were asking around value-added kind of processing or products in particular is one of the fastest growing innovator categories that we've been tracking. We have over 400 nonprofits and for-profits that we've been tracking, and many of them are in that space, ranging from kind of things around soups and jams and things that you hear about regularly, but also, how are we creating new flour products? How are we taking spent grain? Just huge amounts of innovation that are happening here right now. So I think it's an area we're excited to see continue to grow, both products that can be consumer facing and actually get a little bit to that consumer education piece as well, but then also products that go into food service or into even kind of CPG packaging companies as well. On the imperfect produce side, I think we've continued to see this area grow as well, and retailers are starting to incorporate it into their supply chains more. Food service in particular is, I think, one kind of key opportunity for continuing to grow, just given that there's so much kind of prep work that happens there as well. The shape and the color of a product really doesn't matter that much there. So it's starting to find the markets where those ugly or imperfect produce products fit best first, and then I think growing it out from there. Also building in some of the supply chain kind of elements and components that we see need to happen. I think very similarly to some of the work that's happened around creation of food hubs across the country as a way to aggregate supply and then redistribute it. We need some of those similar models actually to help us address the food waste problem in imperfect produce in particular.
And once you get past that, the supply chain issues and the food that could be eaten that doesn't get eaten, getting that out, there is is food that won't make it that far and will be quote unquote wasted. So thinking about technologies like anaerobic digestion, it's not a new technology, but the way it's implemented, particularly in the US, there's over 2,000 of them. It's mostly in municipalities that are dealing with municipal waste or dairy farms that literally have a pile of crap that they have to deal with. But thinking about if you can create cities that ban food waste from going to landfills, you start creating market incentives for things like anaerobic digestion to deal with that food waste and create a fuel source out of it, and at the same time creating compost and collecting those nutrients instead of sending them to a landfill where they're sort of stored indefinitely. Yeah.
I want to add that Chicago is really, to me, the spiritual capital of attacking food waste. Sure. Feeding America, what used to be America's Second Harvest, was here. The late Bob Forney, who's a saint in my view, I was highlighting him in 2003 with these very issues, and now ADM has funded an institute at the University of Illinois to address just this issue. And the other problem that we find is a legal problem of organizations that are hesitant for fear of being sued to make extra leftover food available to people.
And they're so unaware of the Good Samaritan law. If anybody has not heard of it, you cannot be sued. Never, ever, ever be sued for donating edible food unless they can prove you were trying to harm someone. So if you ever hear someone say, well, what about liability? There's no liability. Not there. Good Samaritan law. Look it up. Okay. Then on a smaller level, there's something that just arrived in Chicago called Buffet Go, where buffets, as you know, buffets have to make it have to have it looking abundant until 5 minutes before they close. Well, what do you think happens to that food? Garbage cans. So there's a website where you can go and say, okay, I want to go to Yummy Buffet 15 minutes before they close. For like $5, you get that big clamshell. If you can close it, you can walk out of there with all those oysters or mussels or whatever. So if you're someone who likes to eat late at night, or when breakfast buffets close at hotels, check it out. It's across the nation. Kanta, I want to get to your question real quickly, but there was someone who wrote in response to David MacLennan's speech, Rick Passo, a part of the Garden Tower Project in Nevada, asks, what are food organizations doing about transparency in the unlikely alliances he talks about?
Well, with transparency, I think one of the speakers spoke about GMO labeling, and we agreed with the national standard on GMO labeling, and it wasn't satisfactory to a lot of unlikely alliances or partners in the alliance because it started out on a state-by-state basis, and I think there's a view that it's not transparent enough or it's too complicated. But for example, I think, and our customers, I mentioned we are not a consumer-branded company. We have some consumer products, but our partners, our customers, I should say, with the new national labeling law, which will go in effect, one is to totally support the need and the importance of people knowing these have GMOs in them, and people can then choose. And so you can, not getting into debate about GMOs, are they bad or good for you, but people make more and more value-based decisions around their food. They don't want GMOs. Some people don't want GMOs. It's fine. So there's one on labeling. The second is the creation of GM and non-GM supply chains. So for example, Danone, so the yogurt, amongst other things, has announced that I think by 2018, they want 3 of their yogurt brands to have dairy sourced from cows which were not fed GM ingredients, GM corn or whatever feed that the cows ate. And we are working with them to help them develop this non-GM supply chain in order for them to meet that consumer need. So I don't know that I directly answered the question about transparency, other than to say there's a place in the world for both. We believe in transparency. People have a right to know what's in their food, who made it, where it came from, does it have GMs or not. And so we, in our calls in the middle, from the front to the end of the supply chain, work with our customers who have increasingly a need to have alternatives and to be transparent about what's in their food.
Thank you. Kanta, you have a question?
Thank you. So I heard this wonderful quote that food security is the fundamental basis of peace and progress. Well, food education is the basis of food security, particularly educating women. Mm-hmm. What are you doing to educate women?
Ken, do you want to start? I can take it too. Do you want to start or do you want me to start?
You go ahead.
All right, so I love that point. And actually, I was thinking about this discussion about different styles of production that we had today. We had a pretty sophisticated conversation here about different approaches to production. That conversation is because you have a lot of educated people here who understand the choices between different production styles. So small-scale farmers, many of them, and if they're lucky to have an extension agent assigned to them at all, if they're lucky enough to get one, that extension agent may not have fuel for their motorcycle to get to them. They may not have up-to-date information, and they may not be able to deliver it properly, including to a woman. So often extension agents are men. Often women are actually doing production in these small-scale farming communities, and the interaction can actually be difficult. So I agree with you that the fundamental starting point is people need to have better education. So there's a lot of great solutions out there, and I'll just use the extension space first. Digital Green is one of my favorite social enterprises. They have started in India recording farmers explaining best practices during parts of the season on video. They make them into shorter clips. They put together essentially viewing parties in communities where they use what they call pico projectors, these small projectors, to project onto a screen. And then farmers ask questions, and they see the information delivered verbally and in their own language, but someone in their own community. And Digital Green has been able to catalog something like 20,000 videos. This started in India. It was so successful and showed such great adoption of improved practices that the government is trying to scale it. They've moved to Ethiopia. They're looking at other regions, and they're trying to pass on some of the same thinking to others. So I think there's a huge amount of power in video. There's a huge amount of power in radio. But there still needs to be, I personally think there needs to be a big effort around literacy. And rural children are still the ones that are lagging on literacy, and girls in particular. So that's my answer.
Now, so what we do through the World Food Prize is, number one, make the point that in a world of 9 billion people, those countries that succeed will be the ones that make use of all their human resources, which means educating girls and giving young women career opportunities, period. And that to do that, we highlight these issues at our World Food Prize Symposium. We have people like Catherine Bertini, who's associated with the Chicago Council, one of our laureates, who's doing school feeding programs around the world. How do you keep girls in school? You make food available to them. Third thing is, we are building a program for high school students across America to reach down and get young women in particular, since 2/3 of all our participants are girls and young women, interested in these issues, including in STEM. And Chicago Ag High School mentioned, I was just there speaking to them. We reach into schools like that. We bring high school students together, and then each year find 25 and send them around the world when they're 16, 17, 18 years old to do internships. This is, to us, the way you get them interested in fighting hunger, in studying science, and applications to this issue, and we encourage other countries to build that and send students to Des Moines to the World Food Prize.
Okay, we've got a question from our streaming listeners and watchers. Nyman Ranch, located in California, asks, how do we tackle food waste from agricultural production with innovative strategies and partnerships? Who'd like to take that?
I'll start, and then I think one of the kind of top opportunities we see on the agricultural production side is better supply and demand forecasting as a way to actually really reduce waste and loss that's happening at the farm level. So both within an operation, how are they planning for what's actually going to be needed, but then how are we ensuring that the right signals are being sent to production on what's actually needed, when it's needed, when to be harvesting. There's certain crops that you could actually have a window of when is the best time to harvest it. And so right now, often there's a glut in the market that causes prices to drop, which then often will actually lead to people leaving production, produce in the fields and things like that. So really trying to get at the supply and demand mismatch, I think, is one key opportunity. And then the second thing I would mention is also thinking about when there is waste that's happening on the farm level, how we're better able to capture that and recover that. We heard about what Amp Your Good is doing around how we can get better, healthy foods into the market and into donations. There's a huge opportunity for actually capturing food that's currently being left in fields and packaging it, preserving it, repurposing it, and then redistributing it to people who are in need. So I think that's a second really big opportunity as well.
So I would just add to that in my view, and I started in the 1960s in the Green Revolution working in villages, is to address food waste, education, human rights, and food production, is to build better roads, upgrade roads, particularly in those parts of the world, Africa, South Asia, who have the biggest challenges. Like Illinois and Iowa and Wisconsin and Minnesota, they all were developed by building farm-to-market roads. And with those comes the storage, comes the trucks, comes the refrigerated transportation that cuts down on it and gives farmers the certainty that they're able to sell their crop and have it transported to the market in a way that they can become business persons and not just subsistence farmers.
Yeah, distribution is such a boring topic that it often feels like unsexy to talk about it, but so important, so important. Another really innovative solution, I was just the MC at this competition for ways to scale up the local economy, and something called Team Leverage. These folks decided to work with Farm Logics to find farms who sell the prime cuts of their animals to fancy chefs in Chicago, but then they end up with a lot of scraps. And then a lot of farmers have leftover vegetables. They decided to leverage the 700 schools in Chicago, the communication networks with the families in those communities, the trucks that already deliver food to all of those schools, and the contacts with the farmers to create these affordable food boxes of food that the farmers needed to distribute, may not necessarily have an outlet for, to bring affordable food to communities that don't have it with existing infrastructure and distribution networks. I can't wait to see it happen. I think that's a really unlikely partnership. Chicago Public Schools, farm boxes, how do you bring all that together? So I'm super excited about that. Yes.
Talk loud. I'm Dawn. I'm a reporter here in Chicago. I write for U.S. News and World Report, Fortune.com, and Civil Eats. My question is, from a farming and policy perspective, what aspects can be done to create more unusual alliances that create less pesticides and more organics in our larger food ecosystem?
Anybody on that one? Yeah.
Go ahead. I was going to answer the first part of that question, which is what can be done on a policy basis to incent the types of unlikely alliances we want to solve all kinds of problems in the food system. That's the one that I'll offer because I'm in the global space. There's a group called Ag Results, which was a number of governments that came together, I think under the G20, that basically said, the private sector has a huge capacity to solve problems. Maybe the international development community isn't being specific enough about what problems need solving. So they put forward different products that needed to be created. One was called AflaSafe, which essentially helps control aflatoxin, which is a mycotoxin that causes cancer and potentially stunting and a lot of other health problems around the world. We've eliminated it here in the US because we have control strategies, including AflaSafe. And so they put out a challenge to the private sector and said, we know that this product exists, but it needs to be locally adapted. If you can actually solve it, we'll pay you for that result. So it put the challenge to the private sector to then respond in kind, and that product is now being manufactured in Kenya for the first time. So that's a mechanism, doesn't get to your specific question, but it's the kind of policy tool governments can use.
I would add that I think more money to public research, particularly through land-grant institutions. Here, the United States, which I think is the single greatest agricultural producer, food producer in all history, created the biggest, most significant, most impressive system of agricultural research ever assembled by human beings. Yet, funding for agricultural research stays flatlined, which means in reality it's going down. More money to public research will be able to, and it can be directed at these issues as well, would be so critical, so important, and given the challenges of the next 30 years, and whether America is going to continue to be agricultural leader of the world, is, to me, that kind of funding would be essential.
I just wanted to say, unfortunately, I couldn't get into this event, and it was kind of devastating. I'm over where they're talking about artificial intelligence and exponential medicine. So to your question, and I wear several hats. I'm a physician, a registered dietitian, an economist, an ethicist, and I'm also a farmer. So I bring a prism that says, and I echo, I'm from the University of Illinois, a great land-grant institution. I bring this to the table. The technological edge has to have an ethical firewall. So when we look at education, it has to be systems-based. Agriculture is a great field, and it's something that people do 3 times or 4 times a day. So what we need to do is focus the conversation on, there are going to be many omics, the microbiome, the eubiome, your own genomics, and if we can in a thoughtful way, I think we can be the leaders to say that in terms of technology, examples like Google and Facebook get in trouble when they don't line up with transparency and ethical divides. So the question is, what are you doing when we have a great threat with climate change that may very well threaten that economic productivity and engine? And to the companies, I look at the last mile as being very significant when you have to deliver a large volume of food. It's that last mile that costs so much in terms of resources. So how do we address that? Again, I was late, but I didn't hear anything about those threats.
So I want to take a shot at it because it also ties into your question about policy, and particularly food versus fuel policy. And today, as most people know, there are very specific policies and mandates for ethanol that don't necessarily take into account that, as farmers know and we've talked about, it's an outdoor sport. You know that. And we've had an unbelievable abundance. We've been blessed in this country, and for the most part, South America, with 4, maybe 5 successive seasons of unbelievable growing. The good news is we've got a lot of corn, soybean, wheat in the world today. However, in 2011, there was a really nasty drought. And all of a sudden, we were importing corn from South America in this country, if you can believe that. And so one of the things that I think needs to happen relative to ag or farm policy is a level of flexibility such that the mandate is not unchangeable, or it's got to have some flexibility that if you get a drought or if you get a severe stress on supplies, which I believe in climate change, so we as a company do. I know there's a group of people that don't believe in it.
When you say
we
mandate,
do.
you mean ethanol mandate?
I mean ethanol mandate. Sorry, thank you for clarifying. But there's got to be the flexibility in policy to say, you know what, this needs to go to food. less of it needs to go in your tank because we're tight on supplies. There isn't any stress in the system right now. Everybody knows change comes from when there's stress in the system, positively and negatively. But I think that's something for farmers and in response to climate change and relative to ag policy that needs to be adopted.
We've got a question over the bridge.
Sure. I mean, what we shouldn't lose sight of is food and energy are very much connected. Low fossil fuel prices directly impacts the agricultural industry as well, especially when we talk about fertilizers. We have a system now where we're basically taking as much out of the earth as possible, especially phosphates. When you look at or extracting it from the air to pump more nitrogen into the soil, that's all riding on the back of cheap fossil fuels. So thinking about not just what happens in this silo of food, but also the energy policy, when fossil fuels will become more expensive again, either through taxation or a carbon tax or the natural market. And I think, that's when we talk about policy, we do have to make aggressive moves to make fossil fuels more expensive to get that shift towards renewables.
Man, there you go.
Thank you. I'm from the University of Wisconsin, and I would like to get past when we get people to the table to what happens when we're at the table together. And I'm curious to see what happens when you have these alliances and how you can kind of even out the power influence that you have. There was a conference in University of Minnesota from the Native American Nutrition Conference where they talked about decolonizing the diet. And so I think there's this colonizing, decolonizing that happens both here and when we go in other countries. So how do we make sure that the people at the table also we can trust them, that it's not going to be undermined in some way by access to other resources or power? And how do we make sure that people are heard and acknowledged for their education? So I don't exactly know how this happens when you all get together, but it'd be interesting to find out.
Thank you. Who wants to take that? So when it's a multi-shareholder table, how do some people not get sort of ignored as the small fries who don't really count? If that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah. How do you get past power?
Yeah.
Control, resource.
I'll maybe talk about from ReFed's perspective, which doesn't speak as much to kind of smallholder farmers and things like that. But so we worked with organizations ranging from Walmart and Sodexo, Feeding America, NRDC, many city organizations, federal government agencies, and waste management as well, which many would say is kind of dedicated to continuing to ensure we're putting things in the landfill. And one of the ways that we were able to actually bring everyone to the table and make sure all voices were heard was through a very data-driven approach. So we put forward kind of our data assumptions, our estimates, things like that. And it actually was pretty hard for, we at the beginning had folks who were saying, we think prevention should be a much bigger focus of where you're putting your time and effort. Others were saying, we think recycling should be much more cost effective than the way that you're presenting it. We laid out the data and actually the assumptions or the sources behind what we were, where we were making our cases. And it was actually very hard for people to push back on that. And so it actually enabled kind of common ground and coming together and agreeing on the findings. I think there's some places where that's easier to happen than others. GMOs might be an example where there's a lot of different kind of perspectives on that. That's harder to take a data-driven approach. But wherever it is possible to use data that people can come to and agree and understand what's underlying, I think it just enables everyone to be at the same table.
So we endeavor to bring people together through linkages through universities. So we have a partnership from Des Moines with Tuskegee, which also brings African American young high school students together from across the South. Then they can compete together, and some will come to Des Moines to our Global Youth Institute. We do the same thing with South Dakota, trying to reach into Indian reservation, Native American reservations there. It can be a difficult process, and you have measure successes in small increments, but there are those kind of efforts that at least we're doing, in addition to bringing a lot of different perspectives, just as you are today, to our conference.
Alesha?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think when you talk about international development policy and the kind of work that we were doing, I flew to Nairobi in September to do some deep listening at a forum similar to this, but much larger. It was the Africa Green Revolution Forum, and it had about 1,700 people from across the continent. Very different conversation, as you can imagine. Different concerns in Africa about the food system. A lot of similarities as well, but I spent a great deal of time speaking to farmers and young people and listening to the dialogue, and that's part of how we feed it back in. But beyond that, I think there's a lot. African heads of state and governments are starting to assert their priorities much more strongly. I think, again, in the international development space, it's good to be listening to what those priorities are. I think it's getting stronger. And then also, I was going to point out the role of civil society organizations in empowering voices that don't always get a seat at the table. I think community groups, farmers organizations, they play a really powerful role in advocating for things like land rights and a whole range of other issues.
We've got a question from the Rust Belt Riders, an organization that works in communities around Cleveland to turn discarded food into community assets. They say, how do you move the needle on food waste in the absence of legislation? Are people just going to be good Samaritans about this? Or do we need the legislation? What's happening in the absence of it?
Well, you need both. So, already, there are companies in Chicago that are collecting food waste, and they're for-profit operations. This is happening all over the place. It is limited by the fact that people don't have to do it right now. They're basically going off of people's goodwill and desire to make sure that those nutrients don't just get lost in the landfill. So it is possible to do it, but legislation. You need all three. You need businesses, nonprofits advocating, and the government actually supporting those efforts. So. If you can get those together and make the economic case for it as well, there's a huge economic opportunity there. Yeah. That food waste is actually money. It's energy. It needs governments to either local or state. Good luck, and then and federal. But so looking at the local level, at the municipal level now, that's really where I think we need to focus. And just to talk again about the earlier question, we talk about advocates. All of us are advocates through our pocketbooks. So when we are making choices with the small, we talk about small food businesses or small companies that we believe in, that we know are doing well. Like we can actually advocate for them by buying their product. So.
All right, so a question from Diane Fresquez, a writer for the Pan-European campaign called Science Squared. Asks a question for our lightning round of 3 minutes and 49 seconds left. What would your advice be to President-elect to improve our food system? Anybody got one? Any advice to President-elect Trump?
Sure. The President-elect should assign priorities, whatever he sees or his advisors see, as to what should the American agricultural system be aimed at and what should our food system be aimed at. Now, if Norman Borlaug, whose organization I had were here, he would say, that's easy. Mr. President-elect, say that the highest priority America has is to ensure that 900 million food insecure, hungry people who live marginally in the world need to be elevated and made food secure.
Go down the line, or anybody just want to jump in?
I'd find someone to head the Department of the Interior that is intellectually aware and a good listener.
I don't know what you could be referring to. Anybody else?
I would maybe just build on what was just said. I think so many of the conversations we're having today are around how can we fix a system because we weren't pointed all in the same direction. Someone was sharing with me recently about how, based in California, there's been a number of the soda tax laws that have been going on there. So on the one hand, we're pushing for a tax on soda to help reduce consumption of soda. And on the other hand, we have subsidies and things in our system that are enabling cheap soda to get out into the system. So why do we create a system in a way that we, on one end, have subsidies for something, and then on the other, have a tax for it? It makes no sense at all. I think we could all come up with many more examples that are like that. And so specifically thinking about for the president-elect who, we're talking about how can we reduce government's role, how can we streamline things. There's a huge amount of waste that's all of us actually have around the table with the amount of time we have to spend kind of continuing to try to right-size things for the goals and the aims that we each have for a better food system.
It's cabinet intelligent policy for trade. Our farmers grow great food that can feed the world. And this is an anti-trade world, but when it comes to food and agriculture, have a good policy around agriculture and food trade.
I would advise him to, or try to educate him about the connection between our growing healthcare costs and cheap calories, and that there's quite a few policies that could be adopted to reduce our healthcare costs by improving the quality of the food that everybody eats.
Maybe it should be Make America Healthy Again.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll keep with the theme here since Ken already kind of stole some of my thunder on what I would say, which is that I think that President-elect Trump should make sure that the first 1,000 days is something that every person in America understands, and that around the world we can eliminate child stunting by making sure that's the case too.
Well, I want to thank everybody for being on the panel. Ken, Patrick, Alesha, Sarah, Jonathan, David, please give them a big hand.